important step. It's not going to be all resolved, I think, today's meeting, because there's a lot to go through, but really appreciate, maybe if I'll turn things over to you, Michael, because it's great to get your first take on all of this that's in front of us, and any words of wisdom or even advice from you for our committee would be welcomed. So good morning, and glad to have you on.
Good morning, thank you. And with me today are Russ Jones, Deputy Auditor General, and Malcolm Gaston, Assistant Auditor General, Laura Hatt, Executive Director, Laura Pierce, Director, and Julianne King, Audit Analyst as well. Before turning it over to them, I would like to acknowledge, of course, with respect, that I'm coming to you from Victoria today and conducting my work on Coast Salish territories, home of the traditional territory of the Algonquin, Songhees, and Esquimalt nations. I'm grateful for being a visitor on this land and strive to maintain the connection it holds to Indigenous peoples. I want to acknowledge to the team and appreciation for putting this in place. It's a different approach, and they were adaptable and agile in getting this together, and really respect the work that they did and the knowledge that they have, as you will see today, as they take your questions, as we take your questions and comments as well. So hats off to Malcolm Gaston, Assistant Auditor General, Laura Hatt, the Executive Director in Performance Audit, Laura Pierce, Director in Performance Audit, and Julianne King, who really did do all of this work to get this together. I also want to say thank you to the Clerk of the Committees and the Office of the Controller General. This process has been a collaborative process, and we're all trying to work together on this. So I think it's another sign of the great cooperation we have in trying to work to provide you information to help you do your job as well. And before turning it over to the team to walk you through our brief document, I also want to acknowledge, of course, that this is our first appearance before the committee in June, and that June is National Indigenous Month. It is a especially difficult time, as you know, for a lot of Indigenous people, given the tragic situation that continues to unfold. As an Indigenous person and a member of the Mayapakek First Nation, of course, I encourage all of us to enhance our understanding of Indigenous people, including the successes and ongoing trauma and challenges that we face. I will now turn it over to the team to walk you through the document that you received. Thank you.
Thanks for that intro, Michael.
Good morning, Chair, Vice Chair, and committee members. I'll be providing a bit of a brief overview this morning on the follow-up process. But before we dive into the action plan progress assessments, or APPAs, that came through this year, we thought we'd spend just a few minutes covering off a few details on the process itself, just recognizing that there are several new faces at the table today. It is a process that involves many players. There's the committee, the clerk of committee, the Office of the Controller General, and our office as well. And it's a process that's evolved over time. But our ultimate goal throughout each iteration has always been to support the committee to carry out its role in terms of providing accountability and ensuring that our recommendations are implemented. The current approach that we use today was established in 2015, and at that time, it brought about the introduction of action plans and the action plan progress assessment templates that we use today. So as you know, each audited organization is now asked to produce an action plan when the reports are first discussed with the committee that outlines the actions that they intend to take to address our recommendations and a timeline for doing so. The Controller General then requests an update to that plan through the action plan progress assessment annually thereafter. And that process continues generally until the committee is satisfied with the organization's progress. In 2019, the committee did make some slight modifications to just address the large volume of APPAs that it had on file, which is similar in number to the amount that you have today. And at that time, they identified audits where they felt that additional follow-up was needed. Internally, we use the APPAs to track organizations' progress for our key performance indicator reporting purposes. And we also use it as well to inform decisions around progress audits. As well, we provide support to the committee by highlighting key information for consideration. So if we turn our attention to this year's APPAs, the OCG requested 38 and received 35. 2 received extensions through the committee, and 1 was referred to the Legislative Assembly Management Committee. Of the 229 recommendations that are found among those 35 APPAs, organizations reported implementing 65%. We've pulled together a table that you should have in front of you that highlights the status of recommendations by audit and year. So you can see that for each audit, we've identified the percent of recommendations that organizations have reported implementing rather, which we categorize as those that are fully substantially implemented or have taken alternative action. And the table also outlines those recommendations that are outstanding, which we define as those that are partially implemented or have seen no action taken. We also added in a new column this year to the table that just shows organizations' progress from last year. And you can see that there are 6 organizations of the 29 that submitted an APPA last year that have made progress in terms of fully substantially implementing some of their recommendations. Another observation worth highlighting is that 14 of the 35 APPAs now show that all recommendations are fully substantially implemented, and there are another 3 that are close with over 80% of recommendations fully substantially implemented. But there are some audits that are moving slower. For example, there is the audit of mid-sized capital procurement in post-secondary institutions that is now 5 years old and showing that only 43% of the 7 recommendations have been implemented. And there's the audit of grizzly bear management that is now almost 4 years old that is showing that only 10% of the 10 recommendations are fully substantially implemented. So as auditors, we start to wonder why, and I'm sure that you have very similar questions as well. Are the recommendations no longer valid? Has there been a shift in policy direction? Is it a resourcing constraint? You can't really tell from the APPAs. They provide a glimpse into the work that's ongoing in these organizations, but they're not audited and they don't tell the full story. Further understanding could come in the way of the committee calling witnesses back to discuss, sending a request for response, or in our case, undertaking a progress audit. Speaking of which, we are happy to report that we now have 2 progress audits underway. There is the one on compliance and enforcement in the mining sector, which is a follow-up to our 2016 audit. And there's another one on the Just-in system, which was reported in 2013. Before wrapping up, I thought it'd be helpful to just cover off some factors that the committee may wish to consider moving forward. As I mentioned at the start, this is a process that's evolved over time, and our role has evolved over time as well. In past years, we did provide recommendations to the committee on audits to consider removing from future requests, as well as those to consider calling witnesses on. But we really do feel that this would benefit from further discussion, just to confirm that this is something the committee would like us to continue doing, and if it is, that we have a consistent approach for doing so. For example, when we're looking at audits that should come off the list, should it be automatic when they've reported that all the recommendations are now fully substantially implemented, or would the committee like us to do some further testing to verify that that's the case? And then when we look at calling or suggesting audits where the committee may wish to call witnesses on, should we be focusing on those where progress is waning? Should we have standardized criteria for making those recommendations, such as audits where recommendations remain outstanding after 3, 4, 5 years? It would just really help to have an agreed upon benchmark if this is something that the committee would like us to continue to do. That wraps up our summary of the follow-up process. I hope that you found this helpful, and we just look forward to continuing to work with the committee, the clerk, and the Controller General to best support this process moving forward. I will turn it back to Michael now for some closing comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So I think we're trying to keep our summaries to the point and relevant, and I hope you find the 2 pages of getting this down to a couple of pages rather than 30 or 40 helpful for you. But I think, Chair, I would cut off there and to allow more time for when we get into discussions and questions.
Sure. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Laura, for that summary on everything. Maybe before we turn it over to the committee, we'll maybe go to Carl, to our Comptroller General first, maybe for his comments on how he sees this unfolding as well. So, good morning, Carl.
Great. Good morning, Chair, and thank you very much. So, as Laura mentioned, the current process has been in place for 4 years. In that time, OAG has taken the lead in helping the committee implement the progress assessment process. And in the past year, it's fallen to OCG to become more involved in engaging with the ministries to manage those follow-ups. Engaging with the ministries has provided us the opportunity to receive observations and feedback and to follow up with discussion between government's Deputy Minister's Audit Committee and the Auditor General and Deputy Auditor General earlier in the year. The objective was to evaluate how best to maximize value from the external audit process and the important part progress assessment plays in that pursuit. I was asked to provide observations to the committee for your consideration with the hope that it may be helpful to you in conducting your work in this area. Since the adoption of progress assessments as the committee's monitoring process, the main focus has always been on collecting update information from the auditees and the timing of update requests. Where there hasn't been much discussion has been on when the progress assessment is complete or when progress updates are no longer the most effective approach to follow up. I note that this year during the COVID pandemic, we had a lot of other challenges to address during the follow-up process. But my overall observation is that with 35 reports to follow up on, it would be challenging to see how the committee would build that amount of time into the annual schedule. So there might be opportunities to look at efficiencies. As Laura mentioned, for this year, 38 audit reports were on the list. Ultimately, there were 2 extensions. One was redirected, and that leaves the committee with 35 audit reports to receive progress assessments on and to determine how best to follow up. That's an increase from last year, an increase from the year before. If no further direction or efficiency is determined, chances are that list will keep growing year after year after year. That's what we're seeing. Reports are requested regardless of the stated completion ratio. 15 of those audit reports are listed as recommendations fully complete, self-assessed by the auditee, and 11 of those reports have been assessed as fully complete in prior years but remain on the list. So a large proportion of the work that you are tackling, as far as the auditees are concerned, they have completed their work in the area and they're waiting for some kind of conclusion or follow-up. 3 of those have remained on the list due to OAG requests for further information. That's good. And 2 of those requests have remained on the list because of the prior committee's request for further discussion in the area. It's the committee's discretion to request updates or to call witnesses for discussion on a matter. The committee may find efficiency in establishing guidelines or criteria for when progress assessments are no longer required or for when more detailed follow-up is desired. Establishing criteria shouldn't be seen as constraining the committee's ability to follow up on things, but it might help your supporting agencies like the clerk's office and OAG to help steer or guide the process on a day-to-day basis. As Laura mentioned, 8 of the audit reports are greater than 3 years old. And for me, my question is, are audit recommendations all the same, and do they remain current for years and years and years? Or is there some reasonable time period where you need to reassess and determine whether or not those recommendations are stale or not? Some of the considerations that we have discussed internally or have been observed by auditees include whether recommendations are addressed through achievable administrative changes, changing a document, changing a system, changing a process, or through longer-term evolution of policy direction or legislative shifts. I think the Grizzly Bear audit is a good example where it's not simply a matter of changing some filing process. It is a long, multi-year evolution of a policy environment that they are pursuing. Another item is whether changes in the governance structure or operations have impacted the currency of the original recommendation. Government's not static, changes constantly, ministries shift and are reorganized, governments come and go, and policy directions change. We have to look at the changing environments to see if there are any impacts on previous audit recommendations to really make an assessment of their currency. We also heard questions about whether development in the auditee's response actions has identified that recommendations have become impractical, unachievable, or have limited benefit. I can certainly see that while a recommendation may sound really good in year 1, by year 5, some additional work or change in the legislative framework may impact whether or not that recommendation would be accepted or fulfilled by the ministry currently. So once again, recognizing that our environment shifts. Whether changing policy direction has impacted the auditee's capacity or acceptance of the recommendation, including whether funding is available to support the priority of the recommendation. In government, there is an endless list of objectives to pursue, but limited resources to pursue them. It is the government's responsibility to establish the priority or ration the resources, be they financial or human resources, that ministries use to pursue those goals or areas. We all know that those priorities can shift as our environment shifts. I think last year's pandemic is a really good example of needing to shift priorities to the back burner to be able to deal with a all-encompassing public objective. Finally, my kind of big item was what do we do if the auditee appears to have simply stalled or their efforts are lost? They've lost direction on pursuing their audit objectives. Now, that's an important consideration as well. So far, we have left it to the auditee to discuss with the auditor, but potentially there is a more efficient way for looking at what's the driver for the holdup or stall, and how do we get beyond that to improve processes or validation. So the committee may be able to achieve efficiency in responding differently to these situations by changing up the following follow-up frequency, providing written questions back to the auditee, interviewing witnesses, requesting re-audit or reconsideration through some appropriate audit process from OAG. That's up to the committee to determine. Talking about now, establishing a plan or a hierarchy might allow your supporting agencies to coordinate and manage this large volume of reports with greater efficiency. So I hope that these observations will be useful to the committee. And as you conduct your work in this area, I look forward to continued work with the Auditor General, providing whatever support we can on behalf of government.
Thanks so much, Carl. I'm going to turn it over. We have a few questions maybe to get things started here. Go to the Deputy Chair, MLA Glumac first.
Well, thanks. I think Nikki was for me, but that's all right. So a couple questions. Are there any outstanding audits prior to 2013, or were they all completed 100%?
Wondering if Michael has a answer.
I'm looking to the team. Do we know the 2014 and older? Does that capture the last one on there? Is February 13. Was there nothing before that that was still carrying? Does anybody know?
There's nothing. There were no APPAs that were requested after February 2013.
No APPAs that were requested. What was the question? Was were all of the recommendations implemented for every audit prior to 2013, like fully implemented?
Do we know the answer to that question? Anybody?
It's Laura Hatt here. Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I believe that because the process started in 2015, we wouldn't have had APPAs on them prior to that. So we used the data that we had in 2015 for those prior 2 years because we had kept a 2-year cycle. But because we only had implemented this follow-up process in 2015, we wouldn't have had the same information that we do now. So.
Oh, okay. Well, that answers my question. Thank you. Another question: when a government agency says that they've reached completion of addressing the recommendations, if the Auditor General's office were to then kind of spend a bit of time to validate whether that's true, is that would that idea be like a extraordinarily burdensome thing? Would it be manageable to do something like that for the Auditor General's office? Or
sorry, did you pause, or you ended the question, right? Yeah. I'll give you some perspectives on that, and then I would invite my colleagues who've been here obviously in the BC OAG a lot longer than me, obviously. So my perspectives come in many ways from my time as Auditor General in Nova Scotia. So in Nova Scotia, what we did was we gave what is in fancy audit terms is called review level of assurance. So it's a little bit it's less than full audit, but there is some comfort there that if somebody says something is complete, we've looked at what is reasonably behind what's covering that complete level status. So all things are possible. If we were to go to full audits on the status, of course, that would be much more work. Now, keep in mind, the first time you do this, it's more work than you do in subsequent years. So, for example, I remember my first year in Nova Scotia, we had that we were following up over a 2-year period, and that sounds like a lot of recommendations to follow up. But it was just the incremental year over year, because once you start doing this, the year before, probably if 180 of those were marked as complete and those had already been reviewed cumulatively, it was the new ones that got added on that year. So it wasn't like redoing the whole thing. And what we did there is we just reviewed those ones where the government said they were complete. If they said not complete, we accepted that because we said, what is the risk? Someone's going to say not complete when they're complete? Not likely. So very low risk. So it was focused. It took us probably in the neighborhood of 2,000 hours a year. So pretty much an FTE or an FTE and a quarter to do this. But we did it in response, and that's just one way of doing it, right? But I'm answering your question. We did it in response really because that's what the Public Accounts Committee wanted. And what we used to do is wait 2 years after the audit, come follow up, and then follow up for 2 consecutive years after that initial 2 years. So essentially, we were tracking the organizations for a 4-year period, giving them the first 2 years as a break because they said, okay, they need the 2 years to do something. And then we would follow up for 2 more years. In my last year as AG there, the committee said, well, actually, Public Accounts Committee said, we don't want you dropping them after the 2 years of follow-up. Please keep with them. And we want to know. We don't want somebody getting dropped off. But there, and I think to the Controller General's point, as part of that process every year, we had a good discussion around relevancy. So if the people we audited felt recommendations were no longer relevant, or they weren't going to do them, they made the case to us, and then we came to an agreement whether we agreed or not. If I think back of my time in the 6 years in Nova Scotia, I think there might have only been 2 recommendations where we disagreed on whether they were no longer relevant. So it's a little bit academic in the sense, generally, it was a fairly reasonable approach, and if something wasn't, if something was no longer relevant, then we did drop it. But also what made things there, so we would set an 80% target. So we thought within 2 years of an audit, 80% of the recommendations should be complete. Now, where we got that 80% was because the government had its own policy that 80% of recommendations should be complete within 2 years. So we didn't make up the 80%. We said that seems reasonable, except in some circumstances where something might take longer. So I'm always nervous just to sort of suggest that just because something is old, it gets dropped as irrelevant, because it could still be relevant. That's a long answer, and I've probably jammed the answer to 5 questions into one. So sorry about that if I put too much in that answer.
Yeah, no, I actually really appreciate that that response, and my own personal opinion, I really like the idea of putting a process in place like this, where there is an expectation that things will be followed up on over a period of time, and that when they reach completion, that'll be reviewed and confirmed, and if there is any reason to question anything, then the committee could call them in and talk to them about that. I really like that idea. So those are my thoughts on that, and I can add a bit more later, but I'll turn it over to other people for now.
Chair, can I make one more response to that?
Of course, Michael.
So the other response I would make there on that is if you were asking me for suggestions, one of the suggestions I would make is that, when you look on that summary of action plan assessments, it's probably time, for a good cleanup of these things that extend back to 19, 18, 17, 16, 15. When I say a good cleanup, I mean perhaps these organizations coming forward, with a one-pager to say, we're still going to do these recommendations and we're going to have them done by X date, or we're no longer going to do them. We don't think they're relevant. Have a discussion with the OAG whether we agree, and then the OAG could tell the committee. Because if you look at some of these, like 2015, an audit of the education of Aboriginal students in the BC public health system, 73% of the recommendations are assessed as outstanding. So I think something like that really begs the question, I think, are you still going to do those? Are they still relevant? And if they are, why aren't they moving along? So I think if we were going to move to something like that, I would throw out there that a good cleanup of everything that is on here is probably worthwhile before jumping in too far down that road. And I think back, we've had a number of public accounts committee meetings this year, and one of the sort of overall impressions I have, or views that I have of having attended all of these meetings, is that when organizations come in and have discussions with you, all of them clearly indicate the value of the recommendations, the importance of the recommendations, and that they're going to do them. That they're important to do, and a number of them have timelines around them. So when I see this summary and I say, okay, why are there 19 organizations that have 20% or more recommendations that are outstanding after all of this time, it really does beg some questions as to the why. And if I think back to the to last week when we had the meeting on avalanche, and page 14 of that report really sticks out in my mind, where the organization had put on one page the timelines of when they're going to have all of those recommendations implemented. So I know that a structured cleanup approach like that on a one-pager, because this could seem overwhelming, just looking at the number of reports and the number of recommendations, but I think a streamlined cleanup process is not that difficult to do, I don't think. Okay, thanks, Chair, for that.
Sorry, could I just follow up on that?
Yeah. Go ahead.
When you say a cleanup process, I'm just curious to understand what you're thinking along that, because I understand, you know, maybe going back to the ministry and they can create a one-pager where they're at, but then what would happen with that? Would this, if the committee wanted to implement a more structured kind of follow-up process, would that be kind of the beginning of a follow-up process where the Auditor General would go and do that kind of high-level assessment on things and come back to the committee, or would it be cleanup as in like, here's where we're at, and then we would decide whether to keep it or not? Just curious.
Yeah. When I think of cleanup, I think it's first figuring out whether all of these audits with the recommendations that are assessed as not complete, whether the organizations believe they're still relevant or not. So if they're not relevant, let's come to an agreement that they're not relevant, and let's get them off of this list. So when I say cleanup, I mean it's figuring that out, so we know for sure that these are recommendations that organizations still plan on doing, and then to build that into a report. You know, we could do a report to you to say, okay, here's, you know, X number of years worth of recommendations. The ones that are assessed as complete, we can provide some comfort that if government has said they're complete, they are indeed complete. And then here are the ones that are still relevant, but are not complete, and then that will help you, you know, circle in to say, okay, you know, if you had 2018 or if you had 2017 grizzly bear management and 90% of the recommendations are outstanding, government still believes they're relevant, then that would help you focus in, I think, on who you want to potentially call in. So I think it's shortening this list, cleaning up anything so that we get rid of any thoughts that some of this is no longer relevant, and we figure all of that out, and then work with, I would suggest then we would work with, you know, pick a number of years that we want to go back to, perhaps it's 2015, you know, and start the process from there to say, okay, if government is saying these are complete, we're giving you comfort they are complete, and by the way, here are the ones that are assessed as not complete, and then it's very easy to focus in on the ones with higher percentages that are not complete. Like if I look at, you know, that 2015 one, for example, it would be very easy to focus in on the two with 73% and 100% not complete. So am I confusing things, or
I guess I'm asking, you know, if a one pager came back and it said, oh, it's not relevant, or we're done with all the recommendations, whether that, you know, would still come back to the committee, and the committee could still, you know, maybe decide that they want to ask some questions to the ministry about it or whatever. Like you said back to 2015, but, you know, I have some questions around the biodiversity report in 2013 still. It seems like that there was a shift, there was changes. It's a bit confusing, and I'm not entirely sure whether the recommendations were fully implemented, even though they're saying they were. So I'd welcome the opportunity to you know, hear from the Auditor General whether they think it's complete, and also perhaps invite the ministry in to talk about that. So.
Thanks, Rick. I think that sets the stage too for some of the discussion and work that we're going to have to do as a committee as we kind of go through this. And I really appreciate, Michael, those different pieces of advice. I had similar questions to Rick on how we can kind of clean this up at the end of the day to make it more efficient, but also to ensure that the work actually has been done and the committee can move forward to other pieces. Maybe we'll go to MLA Sharman next, please.
Yeah, I know a lot of my questions were answered through that exchange. I guess I just, like, we're being asked to do some kind of detailed policy development right now about exactly how we're dealing with the APPAs. And so my question was, is that, are we able to get exact questions that need to be answered and do it in a more thoughtful maybe way? Because I have a lot of questions about is there anything written down before about how we deal with these APPAs? what are we, it sounds like there's a lot of embedded questions. We talked about how long do people do reports that are 100% self-assessed, stay on that sheet. That's one question. What do you do if there's non-compliance? It sounds like there's a lot of layers of questions that we're contemplating right now. So I guess my request would be, can we do it in a way that helps us see what the questions that we're meant to be asking today are, and maybe in another meeting in a fulsome way. Just some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. And I think once we get through some of these direct questions, I think to the Auditor General and the Comptroller General too, this is where I said at the onset, I believe for the committee, we're going to have a deep discussion, I think, on process before we actually dive into a lot of the actual reports, because we have to be comfortable as a committee on the way we want to see this roll out and best use of everyone's time as well. It's definitely not a one meeting resolve, I think, on this one for sure. And you, Nikki, really highlighted the fact I think we have to look at process more than anything to make sure we're comfortable moving forward. So if we can, maybe we'll take that as a committee kind of discussion after we finish this, if that's okay.
I guess just to know, is any policy been written down to date, or is it just a process that maybe not be written down at this point about how to deal with this?
Thanks, Nick. Actually, maybe at that point, can I turn it over to Jennifer, maybe, if you have some input there, Jennifer, because you've got the experience that we don't for the past practice. We don't want to reinvent the wheel either, if there is a process already in place that we can evaluate first.
Yeah, Mike, thanks for that. I actually might turn it over to the Auditor General and the Comptroller General, because I think their offices have really been working closely together on this process for quite some time, and I think they might be in a better position to answer that, Mike.
Okay. Michael, do you have something you're able to help us with there?
Sure. Maybe, I mean, I can, it sounds like we're passing this along, but we're not really. I will ask Laura Pierce to walk through that processing on the beginning, but I think to MLA's, Sharma's point, I think it's true. I mean, we can come up with, suggestions, proposals, as the deputy chair sort of, got me going down that road. But I think as the chair, what role does the committee want to have in here? And I think, if I was going to give some advice, the advice would be, what do you want from the government? What do you want from the Auditor General in terms of assurance? What comfort do you want from the Auditor General on any of this stuff? Right? What is important to you to get from the Auditor General, and then how do you want it, and what kind of structure do you want it in? And then I think all of that really is to feed into the objective of what role do you want to have in looking at these, particularly the recommendations that are assessed as less complete. What role do you want to have in talking to the organizations about why their rates are what they are? Laura, do you want to walk through the perhaps it's on the front of the follow-up process as to where we are now?
Yes, I would say that there is a fairly defined process in place for requesting the action plan progress assessments, but the process or the work that takes place afterwards in terms of providing the committee with recommendations, that is more fluid. There's no defined process or instructions in place for that, but that's certainly something that we can work together on, but nothing in place right now.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, thank you. Jennifer, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I can, Mike. And when the APAs come to the committee, in the past, the committee has referred them to the subcommittee to take a look at and provide some recommendations back to the main committee on perhaps areas that they see as could be a benefit to have or ask for some more information in writing, or to ask the committee to ask the audit organization to come back and appear before the committee and respond, or those that or any other actions that the committee might want to take, but there haven't been clear parameters, Nikki, on what exactly what determines what course of action the committee chooses to take. So it has been very much at the discretion of the committee as to how they wanted to proceed with next steps on the APAs.
Okay, thank you. And obviously, Nikki, by that discussion, as you can see, that's something we definitely have to come back to and make some decisions on. MLA Banman. Sorry, Bruce, we still can't hear you. Okay, he's, yeah, for some reason, MLA Banman's microphone's not working, so we'll have to look at that afterwards. Did you want to put something in the chat, or okay, Jennifer or somebody can maybe help you with your audio and look at that. MLA Star Check while we wait for Bruce.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. Michael, I was looking at some of the older ones, similar to MLA Glumac, going back to the Evergreen line and some of the target dates that are coming back, and one of them specifically was spring 2021. And I was wondering if there's any sense of urgency at certain times, because we know that there are very large projects in Metro Vancouver with the Broadway line and the Surrey Langley line that's coming. And will these recommendations that are not complete have any influence on the construction of those lines?
Michael.
So my response to that, and again, I'm not ignoring your question, but I think it's I wouldn't have the details on that, but I would say that's why I believe that's why we do this work. And that's why we bring you this information, because if I look at that summary that the team has put together, 19 of these audits in the last, if we go back to 2014, 19 of these audits show more than 20% of the recommendations as still being assessed as outstanding. That seems like a lot to me for 19 of them. So I think, if you're asking me my advice, it would be that at a minimum, you write to these organizations and you ask them the question that you just asked, right? To say, what are you still doing these recommendations? What are the risks that you're carrying with this number of recommendations still outstanding? And when are you going to have these? When are you going to have these done? During my time in Nova Scotia as AG, the committee would use this to say, okay, government has set its own target of 80% within 2 years. We have a summary here that they would have a summary that shows the number who didn't reach that, and then they would pick the ones that they want to write to and then start calling in some of the other ones. It varies across the country, and I'm not saying that's the best process, but that is a process. But I think your questions, that's why we're bringing this forward.
Mr. Chair, if I might add one more. The format that we see, it's a status of recommendations. You see recommendation 1, you see recommendation 6, that they are partially implemented. Am I to assume that 2, 3, 4, and 5 are done and there was nothing after 6, like there wasn't a 7th or an 8th or a 9th or a 27th? That's what's kind of missing in my read of what's there, and I'm just not sure if I can see it, because we can see what's outstanding, but we can't see what's been completed.
Laura, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I can answer that one. Yes, you're correct. The other 5, there were 7 recommendations total in the Evergreen audit. The other 5 have been reported by the auditee as fully substantially implemented. And we did do a progress audit on the Evergreen Line Rapid Transit project in 2017. And I believe at that time we concluded too that those 5 recommendations were fully substantially implemented as well. So it was just those 2 that remained outstanding at that point that remain outstanding now.
Is that good then, Mike?
Sure. I mean, we can see in that one summary document that there was 7 and there's 2 outstanding, but in the meat and potatoes of that very detailed document, it doesn't appear in there. That's all. But I can get it.
Yeah, I was just going to see if Bruce's mic was working yet. No? Okay. Rick, I see your hand still up. Or did you have another question?
I did, yeah. Okay. Just getting back to Emily Sharma's suggestion for process, I agree. I think maybe one idea would be that the clerk's office could come back with a sort of a list of decision points or questions around process from this discussion. For example, like after how many years would the Auditor General reapproach the ministry to get an update or to re-engage, and what would happen when 100% of the recommendations are complete. I think we could, or we could take that away to a subcommittee and sort of come up with a set of questions or proposals to bring back to the broader committee. But I do agree that we should tackle this in sort of like decision points. Do we want to do this? How do we want to do it? And what's the time frame of these various points where we interact with the ministry and things like that. So I very much would like to hear from others on how we would handle that, whether we would take it away to a subcommittee and kind of come back with some ideas, or whether the clerk could sort of structure that and we could do that as a full committee.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, actually, I've been making notes too as we've been going through, and there's been some great questions, and a lot of it revolves around process to move things forward. I am going to say that I know most government agencies would prefer and love to see their action items removed from this list, but that falls back on them and also some work of this committee as well. So I had made a note, Rick, and maybe this is the time I'll make that comment, is definitely around the process and work to do that the committee probably allow and refer back to the subcommittee to come back with some recommendations to work with the clerk more offline, and we can try to get that process underway to make sure it's the best use of everyone's time. And we also want to make sure we give good direction to staff as well on what the objectives are that we're looking for as a committee once we decide. But do really appreciate so far everybody's, I think, on the same wavelength of we need to not only clean this up, but find a succinct process in order to do that. So any other questions or comments right now? Bruce, okay, so maybe I'll read this out for Bruce. So Bruce's question was in regards to COVID. It's an interruption, I believe is what he means. According to the Minister of Citizen Service, most of those who went home had government devices and were able to continue working. That being the case, is there any reason that the recommendations and work could not be done in that ministry? Michael, do you understand that question?
I do understand that question, and I think, again, I think it demonstrates the importance of discussion with these organizations or interaction with these organizations so that you can judge as committee members, as MLAs, whether you think that is reasonable or not, right? We're providing this information to you so that then you can judge and hold government accountable as to what you think is reasonable or not reasonable. So I couldn't give a blanket answer other than to say I think it's important to engage with these organizations to say, are you still going to do these things? Are they still relevant? And if so, what's your timeline for getting these things done, and what is your expectation for getting things done? Because I go back to sort of we've had 10 or 11 meetings this year, number of witnesses come in. Nobody going to take 5, 6, 7, 8 years to do a recommendation, right? The overwhelming responses tend to be, we're going to get this done if I recall, just as a generalization, would be a 2 to 3 year period. So I'm a little bit surprised, to be honest, coming in new as Auditor General here, that there are this many audits with recommendations that are outstanding for this period of time. And it does cause me to pause.
No, and I think there's probably a lot of heads shaking, agreeing with you, and so we have a little bit of work to do. Any other questions maybe for the Comptroller General or Auditor General before we can maybe have just a quick discussion on next steps with the committee? MLA Taggart.
I do apologize. I had technical difficulties this morning, similar to my colleague MLA Banman, I think. I think it's really important that as a committee, we put together a process that shows that there will be follow-up from the committee level, that shows that we're committed to that, and that these things do not drop off year to year, and that they are important recommendations and it's important work. And so I share the concern that many have expressed in regards to where we're at with some that have not completed, and what our role as a committee is in encouraging that. And so I also agree with MLA Sharma. I am a policy person, and I think it's important for everyone within government to know that we are developing a policy that will support that follow-up of the AG's office and this committee on the important work that's been done. So I'm looking forward to discussing that policy based on the discussion today. And I think it sends out a strong message that we want to be efficient. We want people to really pay attention to the recommendations and to know that this committee will be following up. So I've enjoyed the conversation today, and I think it's important work.
Thanks, Jackie.
Chair, can I comment on that, even though it wasn't a question to me?
Sure, Michael, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that, for those comments, Jackie. And I was just going to say, week to week, month to month, if there's two questions over the last 7 years I get asked most as Auditor General is, one, how do you pick the audits you do? Two, what happens after? Whoever follows up when you make these recommendations and can do things just sit there. So though you're hitting the nail on the head, I think, because that is probably the number two question I get asked is what happens after. The other comment I was going to make is, it goes back to something that I said before, is when you talk about policy and stuff and processes of the Public Accounts Committee, it may also be worthwhile to think about how that builds in to questions to witnesses when we do an audit to say, what is a government's expectation? Like, does government have a policy to say, generally X percentage of recommendations should be completed within this period of time? Because that gets easier for you to do your job and for us to take a role. If government thinks that, they should get 80% done within 2 years or 90% within 3 years, that makes it easier for everybody to figure out. So I'm a big process and policy person as well. And I would offer that there's that other element there as to what government is trying to achieve with implementation.
Thanks, Michael. Any other questions? MLA Anderson.
Good morning, everyone. I was just curious if there's ever a recommendation given and the answer is, no, we're not going to do it. I'll let the team comment specifically on the BC experience, but over my time in Nova Scotia, there was probably, with 10 or 12 audits per year, 99.9% of the recommendations were agreed to. If anything, I would work hard to try to say to organizations that we were auditing, if you don't agree with the recommendation, don't say you agree. Indicate why you don't agree. Let's talk about whether the recommendation makes sense. Let's talk about whether there should be a different recommendation. And if we fundamentally still get to the recommendation we think makes sense, there is a disagreement on the whether they're going to do the recommendation, then let's go before Public Accounts Committee if they so choose, and let the Public Accounts Committee understand. So during my time in Nova Scotia, there was probably only really one recommendation where, you know, we said don't build a school because it didn't make sense. And the government said we're building the school. We continued to say don't build the school when the school was half built. So that's how strongly we felt about it. But that was one recommendation over my 6 years. So it's generally we work hard to give recommendations that make sense, and that's why I think that does beg the question. Then, if the recommendations are so valuable, if they're relevant, if they're risk related, and organizations, as you see when they come before the committee, indicate that they are going to do these things, that it is important and helpful, then it does sort of beg that question as to then what? What is your timeline? When can we expect you to have this done so that we can hold you accountable? My answers are always long, sorry.
Brittany, are you good?
Just really, okay. I really appreciate it though, thank you.
Yeah, and actually I had a similar question. I'm glad that you brought that up because I would far rather, as you said, Michael, we should be having that discussion of whether we agree or disagree and move it forward in that respect, rather than it being pushed further and further onto the far corner of a desk and not being dealt with in a timely manner. And so I think that brings us back to maybe trying to look at cleaning some of this up. If things are irrelevant, then let's get that discussion started and move them off the list if that's the direction that we're going to go, rather than people just, I don't want to use the word necessarily slow walking, but maybe not putting the relevance to it anymore because policy directions may be changed. So my apologies, Laura had her hand up. Did you still have a point, Laura?
No, I was just going to say as well that what we provide in the APPAs is that alternative action, because sometimes at the end of the audit, we're all in agreement because we do work really hard to get that agreement in terms of what the recommendations are before we publish the report. But, you know, a year later when they're thinking through their APPAs, things have shifted. And so rather than, we try not to be very prescriptive, we identify what the problem was and then provide them with the opportunity to get ways to fix it. And to Carl's point, you know, our job isn't necessarily to tell government to direct more resources to one thing or another. Our job is to identify the problem and to addressing, and it's up to government or management to really identify how they're going to do that. So we do provide that flexibility within the current process. If at the time of the end of the report, we're all in agreement, but you know, it comes the budget time or they're thinking through other areas that they need to move resources or they have a different way of approaching it, there is always that opportunity for them to record that within their APPAs. And that's what that alternative action tag or whatever you want to call it is there for. So that's also part of the process.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura, for adding that. Rick.
Just as a closing thought, I just want to say how excited I am by this discussion because I think this is some very important work that this committee can undertake this time around to put some structure and process into place. And I think benefiting from the wisdom of the Auditor General and his previous work, I think, and working together to come up with that process is going to be, I think, very important work for future committees to put that in place. And so I'm very excited about that. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Any further comments before?
I have one. If I can make one more.
Michael.
Yeah, on that, Rick, and you know, if I think back over the 6 years that I spent as AG in Nova Scotia, credit to the public service and those running government, credit to the Public Accounts Committee down there, and I said this publicly in leaving, with the focus of the Public Accounts Committee there on the recommendations, the focus within government, the goal of having recommendations complete in government, and then our streamlined approach. What we saw over those 6 years I was there is the percentage of recommendations complete within 2 years of audit went from 56% to 75%.
which is a pretty significant increase over that 6-year period. Like I said, credit to government, credit to the Public Accounts Committee, you know, yeah, it all worked really well. So I think processes and structure and, you know, direction and focus can result in things getting complete. And, you know, ultimately, you know, we all want to see these things implemented.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I think we have some discussion and work to do even as a committee, because we have the short-term work, as Jennifer has highlighted for me. We have the short-term work of trying to figure out where we want to go right now with the existing process on trying to remove or at least have the discussion as a committee on some of the APPs. But then it's also the discussion of, you know, going forward into next year and the year after, is there a better, more streamlined way of doing this? And that's a discussion that a committee can also have for the next year as we roll out. And I think everyone would appreciate, at least I know myself and what I've heard from a lot of the committee members who are process oriented. My life in the private sector, I was always worked on Gantt charts. Everything was on charts, but for me, you know, if we lay the timelines, but we'll also lay the expectations so people know what is expected, the streamline aspect will probably be a lot better, I think, and a better result for everybody and better use of everyone's time to make sure recommendations are being followed through. But then, of course, the committee's doing their due diligence on insurance with that, with the work with your office, Michael. So thank you. Just wanted to see if there was any more comments before we maybe look at next steps. No, so I don't see any more. So Michael and your team and Carl, thank you so much. It's your prerogative to stay on if you wish. We're probably just going to have a couple of discussion and next steps with the committee. But again, thank you. I know we're going to be talking to you really soon, especially as we try to sort through not only the 300-400 pages of all the APPs, but also on the process. So, and always, as always, appreciate your advice and your recommendations and the work you brought with this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So have a good day, good week.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. Okay, so for the rest of the committee, just a couple of things then. First of all, before I know everybody's busy, but looking for some direction from the committee. First of all, we have next Monday, we had penciled in a meeting, another public accounts meeting. There was no official agenda, but the thought was we penciled that in everyone's calendar in case we wanted to do follow-up from this meeting and further discussion as a whole committee. The other thought is if the committee wanted, they could refer this back to the subcommittee to have a discussion and bring back recommendations to the committee. I leave that open in your hands for ideas and advice. MLA Sharma.
Thanks for that, Chair. So my thoughts are that I wonder if a subcommittee could take this on. It sounds like from my my listening to the answers, there's a lot of kind of detailed questions to be answered, and probably would take a lot, maybe a subcommittee really diving into it to figure out exactly what a recommendation might be. So I think it might be a little bit unruly for us to do it as a whole committee. Personally, we can give feedback maybe at another meeting, but it'd be great to see something written down.
I see a lot of heads nodding, and I think you know, I can work with the subcommittee if that's the direction then of the rest of the committee members, where we can you know, working with staff, try to come up with a good process to really figure out how we want to jump into this and utilize everybody's time, I think, Nikki, appropriately. Rick, did you have any comments on that? I know you mentioned it a little bit earlier in today, if that's still kind of where your head is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that'd be a good way to go. Would the idea be that the next meeting that's penciled in would instead be the subcommittee meeting? And then I have a follow-up question.
I guess that would be up to the committee for best use of time, but Jennifer, I think that's something that could be done, right? We could just, instead of being a full committee meeting, use that time that's already penciled in for the subcommittee to move forward with that time lot.
Yes, that's correct, Mike. When we made the work plan for the 3 months out, we sort of did it as a hold, like Mike said, for further APA consideration and whether the committee chose to do that in the full committee setting or to delegate it to the subcommittee. So absolutely, if the decision is taken to delegate it to the subcommittee, the next meeting on Monday, June 14th meeting.
And then just quickly, if it would be possible to kind of break out those kind of decision points for that meeting, that would be helpful to, I think, structure that discussion. Is that possible?
Well, my thought was on maybe we have an offline discussion, the deputy chair, myself, with Jennifer in the office, of putting a good agenda, I guess, forward for next Monday with some action items. So good use of our time too. What do we want to accomplish in our first meeting as a subcommittee, on what steps, so we can check those boxes, make sure that we're happy with the process as well, and then we know what to bring back to the full committee. Is that what you were kind of thinking, Rick?
Sure, yeah, that sounds great.
Maybe I'll look at the committee. Is there anybody who does not want it to go to the subcommittee, or would rather it be in the full committee setting for the first steps? Or any further discussion on that? Okay, Jennifer, then for my recollection on this, do we have to have a motion to refer to the subcommittee, or can that just be an action item from the committee?
Yeah, that's fine. No motion required. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought. So any further discussion on that point then for today? Okay, I don't see any. One other thing I had on other business was just a reminder for everyone around the Canadian Council Public Accounts Committee. The AGM, again, is coming up September 8th, 9th. Alberta is the host. We are the vice chairs of that committee. Remember, this is virtual. We had another call, and we've got another call scheduled this week with the full federal committee on some of the next steps that we're doing, and I'll report out on that to everyone later. But just a reminder, I believe we sent the link out last week, so you can make sure it's penciled in and look at registering as well. Any other comments today under other business from anyone? No, I don't see any. So, okay, well, I think the direction from today, that was really good discussion. I appreciate everyone's questions and the input. So we'll refer, as we said, next Monday's meeting to the subcommittee, and we'll have some discussion around there based on today's direction and thoughts from everybody on the committee. Jennifer, is there anything that Jennifer's shaking her head, so I've covered off my stuff. So seeing no other questions then, I wish everyone a good Monday, and a motion to adjourn from MLA Sharma. All those in favor? Opposed? It's carried. Thanks everyone for a good meeting, and we'll talk soon. Rick, we'll talk soon.